I want to carry on our discussion now on this whole topic of conversion. I find it a fascinating one. I can really get into this topic because it really relates to the very core of our being. You know, it takes us back to the place where we are most ourselves and begins to ask really difficult questions about how we're going to make improvement and how we're going to sustain growth in life. I often think that that's one of the problems in life, is to make it over the long haul, to figure out how we're going to keep improving. I always admire people who throughout their life are able to do that. They don't get fixated or static. They have a dynamic quality about them. I always admire that, and I guess I always wonder what the secret to it is. I'm sure there's a lot of elements that go into being a lifelong learner and a person interested in growth, but part of it would be to be able to look at our lives in terms of conversion. Now, conversion often is thought of in terms of doing a 180, in terms of a total turnaround, so that someone is totally living in sin and now suddenly they're living totally in a virtuous life. The word conversion means to move in another direction, to turn around, to go forward in another way, and to make a complete kind of change. And so I think that when we begin to talk about conversion, we have to make sure that we see it in some other way, because a lot of people would just say, well, that's not me. I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm not that bad, and I probably don't have any hopes of being that good someday. And so instead of thinking of it just as a complete 180 turn, that maybe we need to see it as sort of a slow revolving process, or a process of gradual growth in life. So that, as Karl Rahner once said, that every conversion that we make in life or achieve or happens to us is really only a beginning. So conversions are beginnings, not ends of things. They are points along a process. I often think that our life is punctuated by important moments. I mean, we go along, there's a lot of routine and daily things that are happening and so on. But now and then important things happen. The Spirit sort of percolates to the surface. We make a move. We decide to do something in a better way. Those become high points, important points for us in life, but they are still part of a process. So any conversion we would ever undergo would be part of some sort of larger thing. Well, in Catholic circles, we've not had in the past a whole lot of writing about conversion. In Protestant circles, it's always been a very big term and important idea. They have sensed the sinfulness of the human condition. Part of the Protestant understanding of the world has been a strong sense of original sin and of the corruption of human nature, and as Calvin went so far as to say, the depravity of human nature. And because they had such a strong sense of sin, following the line of Augustine, I suppose, and a lot of Paul's thought, the sin of the world and the sin that infests our heart, they really had a strong sense as well of the need to turn that around, to move away from it, to make a decisive sort of change in life, to become a converted person. So naturally the revivalist movement and so on grew out of that Protestant sensibility. But often for us Catholics, we've been more sacramentally oriented. We've been more oriented to the goodness of human nature, the fact that we are graced, that we are divinized creatures. And there's been less sense of this need for conversion as a result. So I think it's important for us Catholics to latch on to the Word. It is a healthy Word. It's part of our biblical heritage, and it does tell us important things. But we're probably going to have to hear it not as doing this 180, complete turnaround, but as part of the gradual process of coming closer to Christ, a thing that says that life is punctuated by important moments, and that it's possible in life to make decisions to do better, that we can decide to deal better with our emotions. So we can talk about an affective conversion, as we've done, and we can say that sometime I might decide that this jealousy that is in my heart has to be dealt with, that it's inappropriate, and I must try to live now in a new and more open way. I make that decision. So there's a strong volitional side to this conversion notion. And besides, when most of the writing in conversion in Catholic circles in the past was done in terms of changing religions, it was talked about in converting Jewish people to Catholicism, or converting Protestant people back to the fold, to the mother church. much of the conversion literature and talk was along that line about how important that was, and how we needed to work at it, what kind of techniques there were to accomplish conversions, and so on. Now, I'm using the word more not to convert somebody else or to change religions, but to look at the process of self-growth, to look at self-development, to look very personally as how can I improve in my life? How can I improve emotionally, intellectually, morally, religiously, in a Christian way? How can I appreciate beauty more? How can I be more imaginative in my life, and so on? How can I take all the dimensions of my life and somehow do better with them? Now, there's been a change in all of this in Catholic circles as a result of the work of one very great theologian, Father Bernard Lonergan, who some would say the greatest North American theologian that we've ever had, 20th century figure, born in 1904, died in 1984, and wrote two very important books, one called Insight and another called Method and Theology. And while in Insight, Lonergan did not say a whole lot about conversion, much of what he put in that book did lead people to think about the question of conversion. And then when many years later he published his master work, Method and Theology, then in there's all kind of references to conversion. As Lonergan got older, he understood the importance of conversion as being the basis for what we are as Christian people, that the real basis for theological reflection was the converted life. So Lonergan has led us now into an era when there's a whole lot of important and good writing about conversion. Many of his disciples have written fine books along this line. David Tracy talked a lot about conversion. John Donne in his work draws on that whole tradition. So without multiplying authors, I would just make the point that a whole lot of the literature today really is dependent on Lonergan. And if one is able to understand that, then we're able to move forward, I think, and appreciate much of what we find in the contemporary authors. I might say this about Lonergan, that he was very big in the beginning in his work Insight on intellectual conversion. And later on, he became more interested in religious and moral conversions. But only very late in his life, I think all the way up to around 1980, before he really understood the importance of affective conversion, of the emotional side of things. So if we're looking for enlightenment from Lonergan on conversion, the very first place to go is his book Insight, and then his whole notion of intellectual conversion. And that's really what I would like to talk about in this particular lecture here, the whole idea of becoming converted intellectually. Now I'd like to go back to a story, one that's quite striking to me. This is a story of a priest who was in a class of mine. It was a graduate course on theology, and it was actually the theology of Karl Rahner, and we were reading Rahner's great masterwork, Foundations of Christian Faith. And the priest was came into the class not too pleased with Rahnerian thought, to say the least. He wasn't terribly open to contemporary theology. He had been a pastor for many years, and a very authoritarian one by his own admission. He ran a tight ship in his parish. He was very classical in his orientation. He had learned his theology in the seminary, and I think he had taken it very seriously then, and he'd lived with it ever since. You know, for I don't know how many years, 30, 40 years as a pastor, he was working out of this Thomistic, classical, scholastic theology that he had learned as a young seminarian. It hadn't really changed much over those years. And in fact, he had a certain antipathy towards the modern theologians. He felt that they were cutting in on Aquinas' space, that they were almost heretical in a way. They were saying things that were opposed to the way he was trained and the way he thought that you really ought to function in life. They seemed like those people were undercutting his relationship with his people in his parish. He had parishioners who were reading this stuff, and they were becoming more rebellious and wanted to think on their own and so on, and this was creating all kind of problems for him. Well, he came into my class, and as I say, I would term it rather antagonistic. He would challenge much of what we were reading about Rahner. He would ask very difficult kind of questions that had a barb to them or a slant that let me know that he didn't think much of the direction we were going in. And then as we were going on in the course, I began to sense a little bit of change in him. And I noticed there was a different slant to his questions. They seemed more open-ended to me, as though he was really inquiring as to what this was all about. I used to ask the students at the beginning of each class how many pages they had read in the Foundations of Christian Faith. They were assigned so many. That was my way of seeing if they did their assignments or not. But I noticed that he always read about twice as many as were assigned. I began to sense that he had this great interest. And he began talking to me outside of class and looking for more reading suggestions and so on. He became genuinely interested in the subject matter. He began wrestling with it. He began really engaging himself with what Karl Rahner was saying. Very difficult theology, totally opposed to what he had learned in many ways, a different framework entirely, and he was trying to work his way into that. It was a great example of somebody really setting aside their own categories, their own lifelong way of looking at things. I think the man was in his 60s, and really giving this whole thing a chance. Well, as he comes down to the end of the course, he tells me that this course has been extremely important to him. In fact, he's called it one of the most important things that ever happened to him in his whole life. That it has changed his whole outlook, that he sees things very differently now. And this was a summer school session, and he told me, he said he couldn't wait to get back to his parish and begin to put a lot of this into practice, and to begin to relate to his people in a more democratic and open way, and a less authoritarian and rigid fashion. And he said to me a sort of poignant statement. He says, "I only regret is that I came to this so late in life, and I wonder if my people will accept me in this way." Well, I mean, it was a beautiful kind of thing. I mean, it was an amazing reaction. I must say that I have encountered this in other cases. While that may sound strange, and it is a striking kind of thing, I have noticed very often in teaching classes like that people will have minor kind of conversions like that. They will change their thinking in some very radical ways, that they will adopt a different framework, that they will have a different interpretive scheme now for looking at life and knowing who they are and where they fit in the whole divine-human relationship. So this priest, it seems to me, really underwent what we would call an intellectual conversion, because he was responsive to the material, because he gave it a chance, because he stayed open to whatever was going on. He really changed. Now, he did one of those 180s. He did a complete turnaround in his theological outlook, from being down on contemporary theology, upset with it, fearing it. He now became an advocate of it, open to it, thought he could employ it to help lead his people better as a pastor. That is a real intellectual change. Now, let's try to see what this all involves. I could put it in various ways, what intellectual conversion is about. For one way of saying it is that it is to move from sort of a common sense understanding of life to a more intellectual one that employs theory. This is one of Lonergan's sense of what intellectual conversion is. To be unconverted means that one doesn't have any critical sense about one. One simply thinks in common sense terms. That one just goes along with sort of a grade school understanding of things. That one is not thinking for oneself. One just assumes a worldview that has been gotten from one's family or one's religion or whatever. It isn't challenged in any way. It isn't thought through. To put it in maybe in terms that more go along with the story of the priest, to be unconverted intellectually would mean we would have a theology that doesn't work for us, really. Now, to speak personally, I think back in the seminary when I was studying theology, and my own experience was very different from the priest's, and it was because of my family background, I think. But anyway, the theology that I learned there, I always felt was sitting on top of my head. That was my image. It didn't have anything to do with my heart or my inner being. I mean, I could learn enough of it to pass the exams and memorize the theses from the Latin manuals and so on to get through the courses and so on. But it had nothing to do with my real being. But what was interesting was I knew that. I understood that, but it was sort of on top of my head. It was a theology that wouldn't work. When I got out and into the ministry to try to preach, it was very clear you couldn't preach that theology. It was not possible. That theology didn't mean anything to anybody anymore. They didn't understand scholastic terminology. They didn't know the categories, didn't think in those terms anymore. When I had to teach classes, it simply didn't work for me. That's all I can say. And that's what I would mean to have an unconverted theological outlook. That would be to be walking around with a theology, and we all have a theology, not just people who study it professionally, but we all have a view of God, an image of God, a way of approaching life, and so on, that is implicit at least. And the question is, does it work for us or not? To be unconverted means it doesn't work. This is the kind of person to be walking around and saying they go to church on Sunday and they say they're Catholic, but if their kids pressed them and say, well, what do you believe, Dad, about that? Or, Mom, what do you think about this? And they'd be unable to articulate it. They'd fall back on something else. They'd either answer dishonestly and say, well, the church says this, or I was taught this, or they'll fall back on something that's really in their guts, that they really believe, and say, well, out of my experience, this is what I think is true. So this is a problem we all have, and not just professional theologians. To be converted, on the other hand, would mean that we move into a situation where our worldview feels right to us, where we feel integrated. It's not now on the top of one's head, but has been brought down into one's heart. It informs one's mind. It becomes our normal, natural way of looking at the world. It forms the core of our very being. And that this worldview that we have now, or this approach to life, is now critical. That is, I'm able to look at it and say, this is good and this is bad, and this needs developing. In other words, I now am not just walking around with it in an unreflected way, but I'm able to see its elements. I'm able to check it out. I'm able to see where I might have to do better and develop it in one way or another. So what are we doing then? In intellectual conversion, we're moving from common sense to be able to use theory. And people do that. In other words, it's one thing to be able to say, how do you balance your checkbook? It's another to understand the dynamics of family economy and how one might be able to function better. There's real difference in that. And that is what it means to be intellectually converted, be able to see principles and patterns and so on. And the other point I'm making is to be intellectually converted means we've got a system now that works for us, something we can rely on and that makes sense to us and that is open to greater development. Now let me try to parse that out a little bit. That's just to speak in very general terms. And I think that what I want to do is pick it apart now. And maybe I've already jumped into this a little bit too much, but in my general statement about intellectual conversion. But let me go back now and try to take those various parts and pull them out and raise them up and see if we look at them more carefully. So first of all, this intellectual conversion would be from a passive and rigid acceptance of this average way of viewing the world to sort of a lifelong quest for truth and wisdom. It creates a dynamic. In other words, the converted person now is in a pursuit of wisdom. Wisdom to me is a very rich word. Wisdom suggests a synthesis of head and heart, of practical action and theory. It means where love and knowledge are fused together. Wisdom, it means that we understand life in terms of the great principles, of the deepest underlying roots of things. Wisdom puts us on the search finally for God. If we're searching for wisdom, we're searching for ultimate truth. And the interesting thing about the word wisdom is that it's hard to say that one has a monopoly on it. In other words, some people might say, well, we know all the truth. Our group has the truth, or our church has the truth, or our religion is in the light and everyone else is in the darkness. Some people say that with truth. But there's not too many people who say, we possess all the wisdom in the world. We almost intuitively sense that wisdom is a broader word, that wisdom's got to do with something that always exceeds our grasp. It's something we're moving towards. Wisdom is to know the deepest well springs of things, the broadest principles that guide things. It is to have head and heart, knowledge and love into a fruitful, dynamic synthesis. So wisdom is a good way of thinking this. So we move out of sort of an average way of thinking where we're in a rut, round and round, same things going on over and over, into a dynamic, exciting thing now. Now I'm after truth. Now I'm dedicated to truth. I won't settle for falsity. I want to be true to myself, to my drive to understand. Now, Lonergan was big on that. He said that all of us have a drive to understand, that we really want to get a more comprehensive viewpoint of what the world is all about. To be converted means we'd be faithful to that. We'd move to a standpoint where we would say, I won't settle for shoddy thinking, and I won't settle for falsehood. I have to be true to my conscience. I have to be true to this search for something greater, which I'm calling wisdom here. Now, if we're able to move in this direction and we are really converted, then we are able to enter into dialogue with others. No, we understand that other people got wisdom also. Other people know important things about life. I don't have a monopoly on wisdom, and I know that, but I'm after it. I'm searching for it. So that sets up a way I relate to people. I relate to people in a dialogic way. Dialogue becomes our tool. Now I want to have deep conversation. I want to talk about what's important in life. I want to hear your viewpoints on it. I want to hear what other churches have to say, other religions, other worldviews, Marxism, whatever it is. I'm open to it. I want to discuss this. And I think always that as we do that, we're searching for a truth that's greater than any one of us now possesses. We're searching for wisdom that's beyond our capability of monopolizing. So that's part, and I'm doing this now with confidence. The really converted person knows where they stand, what they know and what they don't know. They're not threatened by other people's opinions, and therefore they're able to enter into very open and easy conversation. Now they can learn from the other because they're not defensive as they're going about it. Conversion means to pursue wisdom and truth with a degree of confidence. On the other hand, to be converted in this way means that we can live with relativity without becoming mindless or unprincipled. The world is pluralistic. You know, there are various viewpoints from which we try to get at wisdom. There's no one way of looking at it. Now that can really hurt some people. They say, I can't put up with this. This is too much for me to handle. You know, I can't, I need something more secure. I got to know I'm right. I got to know what the truth is. To be converted intellectually means that we can handle that relativity. We know it's the way it is in the world. We realize there's different perspectives. I know mine is limited, but mine is important. But I won't give up my principles or just say one thing's as good as another in the search for truth. You got your truth, I got mine, that's all there is to it. No, I realize that we have to sort it out, that there's some things that are shoddy, that aren't well thought through, that aren't intellectually sound. They don't measure up academically, and I have to be able to sort that out and resist all of that and try to look for what really is sound and healthy and moves in the direction of wisdom. So that's the first kind of thing that I would want to spell out here, I suppose, in this whole intellectual conversion, is this sort of general notion of moving from a passive, average, common sense way of viewing the world to this more dynamic search for truth and wisdom, for a satisfying philosophy of life. For I want to be able now to enter into dialogue with others with confidence and to live with relativity without becoming mindless and just letting go of the pursuit of truth. Now, I think that I'm going to take a little break at this point, and I think often that I throw out all these ideas, and it's almost too much, you know, it's too fast, it's hard to assimilate all of that. And so I think that if we took a little break at this point, that would allow you to think about it, to try to go over what I've been saying. You might try to write down a few notes. You might try to talk to another person about it, but try to express yourself. I see it as doing a couple good things. One, it stops hearing my voice for a while. And the other thing it does is it helps you assimilate what I've said, and always in a personal way. So the invitation really is to go back and say, well, with that general guideline there, I mean, how am I doing intellectually? Is my life dull and routine, or do I have some excitement? Ask yourself, are there any ideas you've been excited about lately? Can you think of a conversation recently where you were stimulated and with it and wanted to go home and read a book afterwards? Have you been to a lecture where you really wanted to pursue the ideas? No, there would be this general question. Where do you stand intellectually? Is your rational side developed at all? Well, let's take a couple minutes to do that now, and then we'll return and look at this more specifically. Well, let's go back now and to try to examine more carefully what this whole intellectual conversion is all about. I'm reminded again of the great work that Bernard Lonergan did in his book Insight. In Insight, Lonergan was trying to show us how to achieve a certain self-transcendence, that is, how to grow in a systematic way. And he devised a number of what he called transcendental rules, or put it in better terms, general principles that should guide our whole effort to become more critical thinkers and to become better people, to achieve, in short, I think, an intellectual conversion. And he said the first rule was that we be attentive to our experience. And I'm going to talk more about each one of these. The second rule was that we should be insightful or be intelligent. We should be inquiring and seeing patterns and gaining insight into what is going on with our experience. And then he said we should be reasonable. We should make good judgments. And if we were able to do all of that, that would lead then to a life of responsible behavior, in which the fourth rule would be responsible. Live a good life in accord with the validated insights that you've achieved. So the book Insight, in a sense, a long tome, large book, is and difficult reading, but it is a commentary on intellectual conversion. It gives very specific ways and careful, detailed outlooks on how to become converted intellectually. Now, a lot of that is going to be my guide in trying to parse out this intellectual conversion. And again, I'm taking it back to personal experience and saying, where am I weakest in all of this, and where do I really need to try to improve? So I would specify it in this way. To be intellectually converted means to move from inattention to our experience and a rather static and narrow base of experience or data to what I'd call a critical attentiveness, in which we gradually expand our knowledge. Okay, to be unconverted would be like the priest. He wasn't attentive to the experience of what was going on in his parish. He wasn't drinking in from it. He wasn't learning from what they had to say. Their experience was sort of ruled out for him. They were just people to sort of be kept in line and to be dictated to and pour in the truth that he had learned into their sort of empty heads, I suppose. That's probably too harsh a characterization, because the man obviously had a fundamental goodness and about him. And so that's a little harsh, but you could move in that kind of direction. See, where the database is narrow, he's not drinking in enough reality. The other part of his experience, I think, that he largely ignored was his own. It is what it felt like to be a pastor of these people. What was he learning? What was going on inside of himself? It's like the theology he had would not permit him to be open to all aspects of his whole experience here. He's working with the same stale, static theology throughout all those years. Now, very practically, that means when he gets up in the pulpit, it's probably hard to find something new to say, because there's not that growth and development in the experiential base that he's trying to work out of. Now, not just for him, we're not looking at this particular pastor especially except as a catalyst for our own reflection. That is, I'd have to ask the question, what parts of my experience do I screen out? There's so many people I meet throughout the day, so many people I interact with. How much of that do I really notice, attend to? Or how much just passes by, fast pace, rat race going on. Experience is fleeting and dense and hard to get a hold of, and I'm really not with it. It's just sort of all going. So at the end of the day, if you ask me, to slice it up a little bit or look at it a little bit, I don't know. I didn't attend to it. Yeah, I drove down the street, but I didn't see anything. Yes, I talked to this person, but I never heard what they were really saying. That is to have this narrow